a moment while people get in.
Okay.
Just gonna let people filter in for a moment. Everyone, we're just gonna give everyone a chance to filter in. We'll get started in a moment.
I wonder how many people have seen the recent film. that's
Oh,
also
the Baz Luhrmann film.
Yeah, yeah.
I know I've seen it checked out a few times this summer.
I saw it in 3D. It was, I hate it, but so.
All right. So while people are filtering in, I'd like to just good evening and thank you for joining us tonight for our keynote event of our community read of The Great Gatsby with Maureen Corrigan. 2021 marks the 150th anniversary of the Wilmington Library. And so as part of our celebrations, we wanted to bring the community together around a great American novel. I also want to thank our neighboring libraries in Tewksbury, Andover, and Chelmsford who have helped us get the word out about tonight's event. This event is made possible through CARES Act funding to the Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. We are in a Zoom webinar meeting tonight. So in the audience, we won't hear you or see you. You won't be on camera, but we do encourage you to participate in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you shake your mouse, you'll see that kind of speech bubble down there that says chat. So please do put your questions and comments in there because we will take questions. And I'm so excited to introduce Maureen Corrigan tonight. She is an award-winning literary critic, the Nikki and Jamie Grant Distinguished Professor of the Practice and Literary Criticism at Georgetown University. She is also the weekly book critic on the Peabody Award-winning NPR program Fresh Air. She is also a mystery columnist for the Washington Post and publishes regularly on NPR Online and the Wall Street Journal. Of course, she's also the author of the book So We Read On, How the Great Gatsby Came to Be and Why It Endures. And I'm going to turn over the reins to Maureen.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to the Wilmington Memorial Library for inviting me to Zoom in and talk about the novel I love beyond all other novels. I said to Erin before we opened this webinar that there's nothing I like better to talk about than The Great Gatsby, and I think my friends and family are weary of hearing me talk about it, so I'm happy to be with you tonight. If we were live and in the same room, I would open this talk by asking you to raise your hands if you had read The Great Gatsby, especially if you've read The Great Gatsby in high school. Whenever I teach my freshman classes at Georgetown, whenever I go around the country to give talks about The Great Gatsby, I ask people, have you read it? And, you know, did you read it first in high school? And I would say almost 90% of any audience the members will raise their hand and say, yeah, I read it first in high school. Of any of our great American novels, and I'm thinking of Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn, The Invisible Man, Catcher in the Rye, of any of them that you can think of, Gatsby is the one novel that you can be pretty certain that an incoming class to college will have already read in high school. If you went to high school in America, it's the one novel that seems to unite us as Americans. I read it in high school, way back when. I went to high school in Astoria, Queens. So I actually went to high school at a place that was in the landscape of the Great Gatsby. And I read it and I was unmoved. I came from a working class background. My dad was a refrigeration mechanic. My mom was a secretary. I read the novel and I thought, this is a boring novel about rich people. What does this have to do with me? I had to teach it eventually in grad school. And by then, I had already fallen in love with it. I had read it again in college, and it was Nick Carraway's voice that grabbed me. It's that voice of yearning and regret, that voice of absolute longing for his dead friend, Jay Gatsby, that drew me into the novel and made me begin to appreciate the gorgeousness of Gatsby, the language and the strangeness of it, all of that. What happened to me in between high school and grad school is actually what happened to America in the 1940s, late 40s and 50s. America took a second look at The Great Gatsby and changed its mind about the novel. And what I mean by that is this: when Gatsby came out in 1925, it was Fitzgerald's third novel. He really had such great expectations for it. He thought, oh, you know, this is going to be the novel that's going to be the runaway bestseller, and gained me enormous critical acclaim. Remember, in 1920, he had published This Side of Paradise. That was his first novel. And it gave the 1920s the name The Jazz Age. That comes from This Side of Paradise. His second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, comes out in 1922. It's a novel about a marriage falling apart. Sold fine enough, but Fitzgerald felt like he was doing something different with Gatsby, and he certainly was. And he also felt like this is the novel that's really going to sell. Well, surprise, surprise. It comes out April 10th, 1925. It gets deeply mixed reviews. The most famous negative review came out in Joseph Pulitzer's World newspaper. And the headline of that negative review read, "Fitzgerald's latest, a dud." Some reviewers got what Fitzgerald was trying to do, but most felt like, oh, he's writing about rich people again, kind of like what I felt in high school. And what's really kind of interesting to me is that a lot of the reviews simply read Gatsby as a crime story, which sort of makes sense. 3 violent deaths, a main character, Jay Gatsby, whose name derives from criminal slang. A gat is a machine gun. That's slang of the 1920s. Drinking, out of wedlock sex, a lot of wild stuff going on in Gatsby that you would find in a crime novel, but it did not sell well. By the time of Fitzgerald's death in 1940, and he was only 44 years old, he died of what was probably his third heart attack while he was living in Hollywood, working, for the movies, punching up screenplays for the movies. By the time of Fitzgerald's death, the first edition of Gatsby, copies of it, were still moldering away in Scribner's warehouse. Fitzgerald's young secretary, Frances Kroll Ring, who was a great supporter of Fitzgerald, and it's to her that we owe the fact that we even have some of the letters and manuscripts, because she packed everything up that Fitzgerald had in Hollywood, and she sent it back east to Fitzgerald's lawyer. But Frances Crowell Ring writes in her memoir about Fitzgerald that his last royalty check in 1940 was for $13.13. And even worse, that number represented books that Fitzgerald himself bought to give to friends. So he died believing that he was a failure. And he died absolutely believing that Gatsby hadn't found its audience, and that whatever he tried to do with Gatsby simply somehow didn't resonate with American readers. It's not an unusual story in American literature that an author dies and then after death, eventually their reputation starts to rise. That happens with Herman Melville. It happens with Emily Dickinson. You know, I could go on about authors who that happened to. But what's so striking about Fitzgerald's turnabout of reputation is that it happens so quickly. He dies in 1940. Friends of his begin, friends like Dorothy Parker, H.L. Mencken, some famous names, especially from the 1920s, they begin pushing to have new editions of Fitzgerald's work come out. But what really gives Fitzgerald a boost is World War II. And I want to talk about that during this talk tonight, what World War II does for Fitzgerald. America reread Gatsby, and like me in high school, going eventually to grad school, you know, American readers were blown away. They saw something incredible in Gatsby. And I've had the thrill, I've had the privilege of reading Gatsby certainly 100 times by now, of teaching Gatsby to generations of students, of talking to people all over the country about Gatsby. Almost everybody says the same thing when they reread it. It's a better novel than I remembered it was from high school. Michael Cunningham, the novelist who wrote The Hours and won the Pulitzer Prize for The Hours, he said to me, I want to have the text of The Great Gatsby tattooed all over my body. That's how much he loves it. Neil Gaiman, the fantasy writer who I met at a publishing conference, grabbed me and said, have you seen this edition of The Great Gatsby? And on his phone, he had a pirated edition of a graphic novel version of The Great Gatsby in which all the characters are painted as sea monsters. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing and very strange and beautiful edition. And I always remember the words of a student of mine who came into my office one afternoon and wanted to talk about Gatsby and said to me, it's the Sistine Chapel of literature in 180 pages. And I was blown away by that statement. And the next thing I said to the student was, I'm going to quote you in my book, which I do. I think he's absolutely right. What I wanted to do when I wrote about Gatsby and So We Read On was to figure out, what was Fitzgerald trying to do with Gatsby, and why is it so different from the other four novels that he completed, and even from The Loves of the Last Tycoon, the novel that he was working on at the time of his death? It's such a different novel. So, in my book, one of the first things that I certainly recognized about Gatsby as I was rereading it over and over again throughout the years is what a deeply strange novel it is. As a great American novel, it celebrates what we call the American dream, that idea that Mr. Nobody from Nowhere, as Tom Buchanan calls Jay Gatsby at the end of the novel, Mr. Nobody from Nowhere can rise to be somebody, whether it's through a combination of luck, hard work, education, whatever, that America offers that promise. Well, The Great Gatsby gives us that dream, but it also tells us that dream has limits. It's skeptical about the great American dream. And you can hear that sort of ambivalence about America and its promises in the famous last line of Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So we beat on, we keep trying, we keep yearning, we keep reaching. And Gatsby enshrines that effort to be more, but it also tells us that our past is going to catch up with us. It also tells us that there are limits. I like to say that Gatsby tells us that the dream is beautiful, and it does so in language that's almost unearthly, but it also tells us that the dream is something of a mirage. And I think all of our great American novels have that ambivalence about America. They're not simply, cheerleading rants about America. They're very um, considered in their appreciation of the promises of this country. Yes, it's a weird novel. Gatsby is very much like a crime story. It's like one of those film noirs that maybe some of you love. I certainly love them. I'm thinking of, Mildred Pierce, Double Indemnity, all those great novels that were made into films by James M. Cain, Chinatown, Sunset Boulevard. Usually those kind of hard-boiled American mystery stories have a narrator, a voiceover if it's a film. And oftentimes, the person who's speaking is the only survivor of the crime that's taken place and is looking backward at what happened. Well, that's the structure of Gatsby. We get Nick Carraway, who's the survivor of everything that's happened in this novel, looking back and telling us about the summer of 1922. The present time of The Great Gatsby is 1924, but Nick is looking back 2 years earlier to the events of 1922 and everything that happened. And you know that Nick Carraway, much like Ishmael in Moby Dick, is going to be telling the story of what happened during the summer of 22 throughout the rest of his life. Just like Ishmael, the survivor of the wreck of the Pequod, is going to be telling that story for the rest of his life. It's so affected him. There's that. As I said, there's the violence in Gatsby. There's the femme fatale, as we like to call them in hard-boiled detective fiction, the deadly women, especially Daisy Buchanan. And so often those deadly women are imaged as being dangerous by being behind the driver's seat of a car, right? And certainly we have that in Gatsby, where Daisy Buchanan is behind the driver's seat on that fateful evening drive back to Long Island from Manhattan, when Myrtle Wilson is killed. So we've got that idea. There's a lot of that recklessness that we associate with hard-boiled detective fiction, crime stories, film noir in Gatsby. And all of those forms, especially the hard-boiled detective fiction form, that was coming of age in the 1920s when Fitzgerald was writing as well. And he was a great fan of detective fiction and mystery stories. In fact, after Gatsby, he worked for a while on a mystery tale entitled The Boy Who Murdered His Mother. So think about that. Why I bring this up, though, is it's really strange for a great American novel, a novel about America where we like to think the future is wide open. It's really strange that all the events of this novel have already taken place by the time you open up page 1 of The Great Gatsby. In other words, Nick is looking backward. So nothing in this novel, none of the events are ever going to be changed. They're sort of set in stone. It's all taken place in the past. And I also like to think of, in terms of Gatsby's strangeness, it breaks that cardinal rule of writing: show, don't tell. Almost everything in Gatsby is told to us through Nick's narration. Once in a while, we have Gatsby telling us some extended story about the past, but mostly it's Nick. And usually that makes for static writing, but somehow Fitzgerald managed to surmount that problem. So those are some of the ways Gatsby is weird, it's odd, it's different. What else? You all know this one. This is a symbol infested novel. We've got symbols about color, about direction, about hot versus cold, about classical illusions, time. One scholar of Fitzgerald actually sat down and counted the number of times we have time references in The Great Gatsby, and he came up with 270, which makes sense. This is a very time-bound novel. It's a very time-bound story. It takes place over one summer, and when the summer is over, Gatsby and Myrtle and George Wilson are all going to be dead. There's a real deadline at the end of this novel. And so the novel is very time conscious. Think about in chapter 5, when Gatsby and Daisy meet, they're reunited at the dead center of this novel. What happens? Jay Gatsby leans against the mantelpiece and a clock falls over. I mean, he's literally hit in the head with time. So the novel is not subtle about its symbolism. And certainly everybody loves to talk about the green light and the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. But I think in terms, first of all, of the green light, the more important symbol at the end of chapter 1 is Jay Gatsby reaching out his hands and stretching for that green light. It's that yearning. Fitzgerald said that Gatsby was about aspiration, and he gives us that image of aspiration right at the end of chapter 1. So I think that's really crucial. And another really crucial symbol system in this novel that people don't talk about as much is the image of water. I think that The Great Gatsby, alone almost among our great American novels, is a novel that foregrounds class. This is our great novel about class in America. And yes, whether Mr. Nobody from Nowhere can become Mr. Somebody and stay in that class situation. Can you really migrate that way? There's a real anxiety in this novel about losing your footing, going under, drowning in debt. I mean, think about all of the ways in which we talk about financial insecurity, mortgages taking on water. And it's so striking that there are very few pages of The Great Gatsby that don't in some way reference water. If you remember chapter 1 and that dinner party at the Buchanan's house, where Nick arrives and he meets Tom and Daisy again for the first time in years, and Jordan Baker is introduced to him, there's there's that strange conversation where Tom Buchanan launches into eugenics, the science of race theory, which was very much an aspect of the 1920s. And one of the things that Tom says is the white race is going to be submerged. You know, he doesn't say the white race is going to be overtaken or wiped out. He says submerged. This novel is a few things I want to say about that, but to go back to the water imagery for a second again, this novel is very obsessed with water. And think about where Gatsby dies. You know, Fitzgerald as a novelist could have had his choice of where to stage Gatsby's death scene. Certainly could have been in his car, in his house, you know, basically any place. He has Gatsby die in his swimming pool. It's the first time Gatsby has gone into his swimming pool all summer on the day that he dies. I like to ask people to go back, yes, to the end of chapter 1, to the first time we see the image of Jay Gatsby stretching out his arms toward the green light. What's he leaning over? He's leaning over the waters of the Long Island Sound. And the suggestion is that if you reach too far, you aspire to too much, you strain too hard, you're going to fall in. You're going to overreach and fall in and drown. And what intensifies all of that amazing imagery and that gesture of reaching over water for something that's out of your reach, what intensifies that image, adds another layer to it, is the classical resonance of who Gatsby is reaching for. He's reaching for Daisy Buchanan. And if you go back and look at all of the times Daisy Buchanan is mentioned in the novel, you know, she's never mentioned, she's never described by Fitzgerald as being beautiful. She's mostly played by actresses who are blonde, because I think directors get inspiration from Zelda Fitzgerald herself, who was blonde, kind of had that almost platinum blonde hair that glowed. But in the novel, the one time we hear Daisy's hair described, she's described as having dark hair. Over and over again, the signature way Daisy Buchanan is described is through her voice. Remember the famous passage where Daisy's voice is described as being full of money. And we're told again and again, starting in chapter 1, that men lean in closer to Daisy to hear her musical voice. You know, she doesn't project, you've got to lean in. Well, again, if we were in person, I would be asking all of you, if you have any kind of background in classical literature, to think about the creatures in the Odyssey who are described solely by their voices. And of course, it's the sirens, the mermaid-like creatures who lure men, Odysseus's men, their sailors, to their watery deaths by the musical sound of their voices. Men are hypnotized by their voices. In some ways, that's what happens with Gatsby. And I could go on and on about the classical allusions here, but I think the big point is this is such a packed novel in terms of symbolism. And yet, as people have said, it reads so smoothly. It's as though you were eating whipped cream. You know, it doesn't always draw attention to its own symbols. It's just as you reread the novel, you become more aware of these depths, of the resonance of certain symbols here. I mentioned Tom Buchanan talking about eugenics a minute ago, and I'd just like to say a few words about that. I think another strange, magical thing about Gatsby is the fact that it's very much of its time, of the 1920s, but it's also timeless, like all of our great works of art. So in terms of being of the 20s, you think about the restlessness of these characters. Nobody in this novel sits still for very long. They're always jumping into the cars to drive from where they are, Manhasset, you know, East Egg on Long Island, to drive the short distance, like maybe 40 miles into Manhattan. And then when they're in Manhattan, they want to drive back out again. People are always changing clothes in this novel, particularly Jay Gatsby and Myrtle Wilson, the two characters who are from originally lower class origins who aspire to something better. It's almost like they're being performative. They're trying to impress people with the outer trappings of the class they want to belong to. So nobody is sitting still. And I heard from Erin that some of you got lessons in the Charleston as part of this whole program of reading Gatsby. You know, you think about the dances of the 1920s. They're very restless. They're not smooth and slow like the waltz. It was a restless time. People were coming out of World War I. They were also, of course, coming out of the 1918 flu pandemic. And certainly a lot of commentators today have made the point that the 1920s maybe give us a sense of what 2021 and beyond will feel like as we come out of this worldwide pandemic that we've been in and we've been sequestered because of. So there's that restlessness. There's also a lot of cultural anxiety about changes in America. You've got great shifts in population. The 1920 census was the first census in which more Americans lived in cities than they did in rural areas. And when you think of who's in those cities, we're getting the tail end of the second great wave of immigration. And those immigrants are from Southeastern Europe, they're from Russia, they're from places where people don't speak English as the first language. We're also getting internal migration. The Great Migration is going on, where African Americans are moving from the rural South into the cities of the Northeast and the West. So there's a lot of movement. And you probably will remember that great scene in chapter 4, where Nick and Jay Gatsby are driving over the Queensboro Bridge. And I love to think about that scene because people quote it because of its beauty. It gives us such a great vista of New York City in the 1920s. You know, the city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, you know. Nick goes on and on describing how beautiful New York is during this age when those great skyscrapers are rising up. But what also happens in that scene is that as they are driving over the Queensboro Bridge, these two white men are being passed by two cars. One car is a funeral cortege of immigrants from Southeastern Europe following a hearse. It's not that great an image. It's a little bit of an unsettling image. So we get the immigrants passing these two white characters. And then the second car is, in the language of the novel, two bucks and a girl driven by a white chauffeur. So the racial hierarchy is being reversed. The African American characters are the passengers being driven by the white chauffeur, and that car passes Nick and Jay Gatsby. So, you know, what about that anxiety of these men, these white Americans being left behind? I think the novel has anxiety about that. And the third anxiety of the 1920s that I'll throw in is the anxiety about women. Remember, of course, women have recently gotten the vote. When this novel was published in 1925, they've shortened their skirts, they're smoking, they're drinking in public for the first time. There's certainly many more sexual freedoms. And again, I think this novel of 1925, it's depicting all of these changes in America, and it's also somewhat anxious about them. When we go back to Tom's opening remark in chapter 1, the white race is being submerged. I don't think any of us want to identify with Tom. He's kind of the heavy in the novel. And yet, sometimes the anxieties he speaks about in that first chapter, those racial anxieties, they're depicted in other ways throughout the novel. Erin and I talked about kind of taking a break and hearing some of your questions and comments like halfway through my talk, because I know it can get a little tedious, you know, looking at the same person on Zoom for an hour. So why don't we do that? I'd love to hear what some of you think about, you know, some of the points I'm mentioning or other points that you would like to bring up.
Yes, yeah, please put any questions or comments into the chat feature. I'll also, I think, maybe take the chance to launch one of our polls. So the first question is a simple one. Have you read The Great Gatsby? And I'll launch that poll and you'll have an opportunity to answer there.
And I see that Erin and I can't vote. No.
Yes on both counts, I think, for the two of us. Excellent. It's looking like mostly yeses. Give another moment for the poll. Okay, and we do have a question in the chat from Eileen. If you had met Fitzgerald before he died, what is the first question about Gatsby that you would ask him?
Oh, wow. I'm a sentimental person, and Fitzgerald is buried in Rockville, Maryland. And that's not that far from where I live near Georgetown in DC. So it's like about 40 minutes drive, depending on traffic. It's a beautiful little churchyard, and Scott and Zelda are buried there with the last words of the Great Gatsby on the slab that covers their graves. And sometimes I do talk to him, but I've never asked him a question, I guess, because I don't expect him to answer. But I would ask him if he thought he had done it, if he thought he had written the great novel that he wanted to write. I would hope that he'd answer yes. That's the question I would ask him. I tell him that he did it. I said, you did it, but I would like to know that he had that comfort of knowing that he had done it.
All right, and the polling is in. We have 90% of our audience has read The Great Gatsby. Excellent. We also have another question in the chat. Maureen, what is your favorite movie adaptation?
Oh gosh. I like the 1949 Alan Ladd version. It's a black and white version that's filmed kind of like a film noir. And, for those of you who are younger than 112 or me, I'll just say, if you don't know Alan Ladd, he was a movie star from the golden age of Hollywood, and he mostly played cowboys and gangster, or tough guys, detectives, that kind of thing. So, and it's a very watery Gatsby. My students hate it whenever I make them watch it because they say, this is not Gatsby. But I really don't like the Baz Luhrmann version. I mean, for one thing, Baz Luhrmann left out the famous line about Daisy's voice. Her voice is full of money. Crazy. And, in this most class conscious of novels, right? And I also think that, like the 1974 version with Robert Redford and Mia Farrow, it really foregrounds the love story, and it just doesn't recognize so much else that's going on with Gatsby. There is also a 1926 version that's a silent movie version that we've lost, but you can find the trailer online. Just Google 1926 silent movie version, and it'll come up. And that looks like it was a fun version, with a lot of kind of Busby Berkeley dancing girls coming down the staircase in Gatsby's mansion. So, but I like the 1949 version. Watch it if you haven't seen it.
We have a question from Christina. What are your thoughts on Nick's unreliability in terms of his narration and his affection for Gatsby?
Yeah. He is a slippery character, isn't he? We sort of learn at the end of chapter 1 that another reason that he's come east that he hasn't told us about is to get out of an engagement that's kind of almost being forced on him. And that's sort of curious because he's done this whole intro where he's told us so much about himself, but he's left that out. That comes out in conversation. And then a few chapters on, he makes that really uncomfortable claim, I am the most honest person, that you will ever meet. And, just think about how you would feel if someone introduced themselves like that to you. You'd say, oh, right, sure. I think, one of my students many years ago made the great point that at the end of The Great Gatsby, when Nick is standing outside Gatsby's empty mansion, And he sees that, as he says, some boys from town have written like a dirty word on the white paint of Gatsby's house, and he erases it. This student said, that's what Nick is doing, in a sense, throughout this retelling of Gatsby's life. He's cleaning up Gatsby's reputation. And I thought that's interesting. And yeah, that does make him less reliable as a source of ultimate, truth about Gatsby. But I think what comes through so clearly, and what I absolutely believe, is that he loves Gatsby. This we could go on and on about the symbol patterns in this book, that it's so overly designed. But one of the other ways in which it's designed, everybody in this novel is reaching for somebody or something that's out of reach. Think about it. Myrtle Wilson is reaching for Tom. Tom is reaching for Daisy. Jordan is reaching for Nick. The only person who doesn't seem to be reaching for anybody that I can tell is Daisy. And I love to think about the fact that her name Daisy the word daisy comes from Middle English, day's eye, and it's the sun, because a daisy looks like the sun. And she's the sun around which all these other folks are revolving. So that's a long-winded answer to Nick's unreliability. He is unreliable, but I love his voice.
Another question is, how much of Fitzgerald do you see in the characters of Jay Gatsby and of Nick Carraway?
Yeah, great question, because it's both, right? When, you can all go online if you want to, go to Princeton University's website, go to Firestone Library, and go to Fitzgerald Papers. And once you get there, and Erin can tell this to you certainly in a clearer way, I'm sure, you can request online to see the manuscript of The Great Gatsby. It's in Fitzgerald's longhand. It's a little hard to read, but one thing that you'll see by looking at the manuscript, the first draft, and there's so many drafts, we don't even know how many drafts there were of Gatsby. You'll see that Nick Carraway is not telling the story. It's not this uninvolved first person narrator. It's a third person narrator. So it's not until later that Fitzgerald inserts Nick, and I feel like, as do many critics, it's almost like Fitzgerald splitting himself between Nick and Gatsby. As many of you may know, Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul. His father's family, he always liked to say, had breeding. Think about Fitzgerald's name, Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. He was named after a distant ancestor on his father's side, Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. He was also related on his father's side to Mary Surratt, one of the people who was in on the planning of the Lincoln assassination and was hanged for it. But his mother's family had money through the grocery business. And Fitzgerald, later in his life, writes a letter to the novelist John O'Hara and says, I was always on the outside looking in. The scholarship boy at prep school and at Princeton, always sort of not enough, always feeling like I was not enough. And of course, there's a famous story about Fitzgerald's first love, Ginevra King, who was very wealthy, and Fitzgerald visiting her at her family's house in Lake Forest, Illinois, which I've gone online to look at that mansion, and it looks like a department store. It's so incredible. But as the story goes, when Fitzgerald was there, at like the tender age of 19, and Ginevra was 16 or 17, Fitzgerald overheard Ginevra's father say, rich boys shouldn't think of marrying, poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. Poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. And, that's Fitzgerald's theme, that poor boy trying to get in the inside. Another symbol pattern, if this were a class, we could talk about, is the number of times you see a character, usually Nick, but sometimes Gatsby, outside looking in a window. That's throughout Gatsby, you see that image pattern. So I definitely think there's a lot of Fitzgerald's yearning and class insecurity in Gatsby. Yeah. I want to make sure we have a time to talk about the great comeback of World War II.
Yes.
So I can be quick in order to leave time for more questions, but I would
Yes.
love to tell people about that because it's such a feel good story about books. So
Yes,
I've
let's get
told
to
you
that.
Fitzgerald is nowhere on the literary map when he dies in 1940. And, you know, as I said, some of his friends who had great literary reputations intercede on his behalf. But there's also another movement from the ground up. During World War II, there was this effort to get books into the hands of soldiers and sailors serving overseas. My dad was in World War II, he was in the Navy on a destroyer escort. And he told me once or twice, we had these funny little books during the war. And I never knew what he was talking about until I began to research Gatsby. So there's this program to get books into the hands of soldiers and sailors. People begin sending their used books, and you know how that goes. Sometimes the books are a little weird and nobody can imagine these guys actually wanting to read them. So 1942, publishers, paper manufacturers, editors, librarians, they all get together in New York and they decide that they're going to publish themselves over 1,000 titles in cheap paperback editions, and that these are the editions that are going to be distributed to servicemen serving in World War II, as well as prisoners and prisoners of war camps in Germany and Japan. Those editions were called the Armed Services editions, and they looked like this. This is a facsimile. They were soft cover, printed on pulp paper with narrow margins, kind of these 2-column narrow margins. And they were meant to last through 7 readings. They lasted through so many more. Over 1,000 titles, everything from Margaret Mead's coming of age in Samoa to, yes, detective stories, to Dickens, Hemingway, et cetera, Moby Dick, My Friend Flicka, an incredible range of literature. The Great Gatsby gets chosen to be one of the Armed Services editions. And so it goes from no sales practically when Fitzgerald is alive in the late 30s, and by the time of his death, to 155,000 copies of The Great Gatsby distributed in 1945. And I've been so fortunate enough to receive 1 or 2 letters when my book came out in 2014 from gentlemen who were alive back then and serving in World War II, and have written to me and said, I first read Gatsby in 1945 in this Armed Services edition. By the way, the greatest distribution of the Armed Services editions was on the eve of D-Day. Every man going over to Normandy Beach, etc., for D-Day in a landing craft was given an Armed Service edition to read. And the reason why they are this funny shape is they were meant to fit in the servicemen's pockets. One of the most popular Armed Services editions that's part of this D-Day group of books was Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And again, if you go online, you'll see some famous photos of men in landing crafts reading the Armed Services editions. If you want to read more about the program, Stephen Ambrose's book on D-Day has a lot about the role that these books played in the war and what a lift they gave to servicemen's spirits. And if you come to Washington, D.C. and go to the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress has the world's only complete collection of all of the titles of the Armed Services editions. Anyone can go into the Library of Congress, into the rare book room, and request whatever copy you want to see. I've, of course, requested the Great Gatsby edition. And, it really is a thrill to hold the real thing in your hand and to think about, the service that these books performed during World War II. So after the war, of course, we've got the paperback revolution in America and Great Britain. Signet Paperbacks chooses Gatsby as one of its first paperbacks that it's going to put out. We've got early TV in the late 40s and 50s, and there were a lot of dramatizations of the Great Gatsby on, Firestone Theater and all of those old shows that used to be kind of almost like plays that were televised. I had the wonderful experience of going to the Library of Congress with a research librarian when I was researching my book, going down into a sub basement because I was trying to find out, when did Gatsby really enter the school curriculum, the high school curriculum? There's no way to recover all of those old syllabi from various high schools around the country. But I figured what I would do was to look at literary anthologies from high school and see when Fitzgerald starts to become mentioned. We spent a day down there, miles of these anthologies on shelves, and we called out to each other every time we had a Fitzgerald hit. It really seems like by the mid to late 50s, Fitzgerald is being talked about as a great American writer. Before that, he's talked about as a regional writer, and he isn't given that much space. But certainly by the early 60s, he's being acclaimed, and the Great Gatsby is being celebrated. I said before, in answer to one of your good questions, that I would love to be able to find out from Fitzgerald whether he ever realized what he did, whether he knew that he had written the great American novel. And I like to share with people this letter that Fitzgerald wrote about 5 months before his death. He wrote the letter to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, who's one of the heroes of American literature. He's the editor who edited Hemingway as well as Fitzgerald, Thomas Wolfe, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, so some of our greatest American writers. And he was a great friend to Fitzgerald. In May of 1940, Fitzgerald is writing about the Great Gatsby to Max Perkins, and he says, "I wish I was in print," because remember, Gatsby was out of print. "It will be odd a year or so from now when Scotty, his daughter, assures her friends I was an author and finds that no book is procurable." Scotty was going to college in a year. So Fitzgerald is saying she'll go to college, she'll tell her friends I was an author, but my books aren't out anywhere. And Fitzgerald goes on to say, "Would the 25-cent press keep Gatsby in the public eye, or is the book unpopular? Has it had its chance? Would a popular reissue in that series with a preface not by me, but by one of its admirers, make it a favorite with classrooms, professors, lovers of English prose, anybody? But to die so completely and unjustly after having given so much. Even now, there is little published in American fiction that doesn't slightly bear my stamp. In a small way, I was an original." That letter always gives me chills because it's May of 1940. By December of 1940, Fitzgerald is dead. December 5th, 1940. It's almost as though he has a premonition of what's going to happen. And yeah, I would like to tell him it's more than a small way that American literature bears your stamp. This miracle that you pulled off in Gatsby of saying something big about America and its promises in 185 pages of gorgeous, luminous prose. Very few authors have been able to approach that achievement. So thank you for listening to me over Zoom tonight. And if we've got some time, I think we've got 5 minutes. I would love to hear from other people.
Yes. Yeah, we have a question. One of the questions from Susan is about the dialogue. She says, why is the dialogue so stilted, especially Daisy?
Yeah, it is stilted, isn't it? I went to see the 7.5 hour production of The Great Gatsby, in which the actors memorized the novel. The actor Scott Shepherd, who plays Nick Carraway in memorized the entire novel, and I had the thrill of talking to him for my book. And we talked about the stiltedness of the dialogue. One thing hearing Gatsby made me realize is it's very funny in the first third, and it's almost like slapstick humor in the first third. It gets much more serious as it goes on. But I think you're right. There is something stilted about it, and maybe we can think back to the fact that this is Nick remembering all of this dialogue. Even though as we get into the novel, we think of it as happening in present time. It's not. It's Nick remembering. And so maybe, he's got kind of this almost literary voice with a capital L. And again, go back to those first few pages when he introduces himself. He's a little stilted. So maybe that's why. Yeah.
Yeah, the humor definitely struck me and rereading it this time. The humor and all the pop culture references that, like,
Yes.
my edition, had a ton of citations, and I
Oh,
kept going back, and it struck me how, just kind of chock full of pop references it must have
yeah.
been if you were a contemporary reader of it.
The movies, especially, is what I think of. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Another question is, have you read Nick, which I believe is one of the books that have come out now that Gatsby's in the public domain? And
Yeah.
what did you think of it?
Yeah, I haven't. I haven't, and no slap against its author. I know so many of these books are coming out now that Gatsby is in the public domain. I was on a panel with another young author who's reimagined Gatsby through the perspective of Jordan Baker as a genderqueer, a Vietnamese American. The floodgates are open. But I guess this is one place where usually I try to have a broad mind as a critic and, respect what people are doing. And I do respect it, but I love Gatsby so much. I kind of want to keep the experience pristine. So I haven't read those editions. I have looked at the two graphic novel versions, which I think are really are cool in parts, especially the Scribner version. Um, I don't think I'll be reading the vampire Gatsby the Undead. I mean, there's nothing wrong with reimagining it. It's a tribute to how Gatsby lives on, but I don't know. It's personal taste. No, I haven't. I'd love to know what you thought of it, but I guess this is the limitation of Zoom. What you thought of Nick?
Yes, but yeah, there's quite a bit of Gatsby content coming out. I know there's I think a
Yes,
Broadway musical, a mini series.
yes, yes.
People will be clamoring for a Muppets Gatsby.
I would love to see a Muppets Gatsby. That I could get behind. Yeah.
One of the other questions in the chat is really a comment, just that this Phyllis would love to take your New York Through Novels class, and
Yeah.
she's suggesting that you consider offering it through Road Scholar or a great course or whatever it takes. She says she would spend a week reading those books
I'm
in New
doing a
York.
great courses, but not on that. It's going to be on banned and burned books. So a lot of librarians are helping me with that one. Yeah.
Joan has a question on, are there any good documentaries of Fitzgerald?
No, that's a really good question. Not that I know of. No. No. Not like the recent one that's come out on Hemingway by Rick Burns. I wish that Rick Burns had done Fitzgerald instead. I love Hemingway's writing. Hemingway was such a horrible person, to most of the people who loved him and helped him, and he certainly kicked Fitzgerald in the teeth. It was their relationship did not end well, but yeah, I really can't recommend any. There've been some documentaries that touch on the jazz age and the Fitzgerald. I mean, Rick Burns' documentary on New York. Sorry, it's Rick Burns, not Ken Burns. The Burns brothers both do them, but Rick Burns does a multi-part documentary on New York, and the documentary on the 20s actually does have a lot about Scott and Zelda in it. So that's worth watching to see that footage.
One thing I was wondering is, So We Read On was published in 2014, and I know you're a constant rereader of Gatsby.
Yeah.
Is there anything you've learned about Fitzgerald in the interim, or any insight you've gleaned into Gatsby that in the interviewing years you wish you could have included?
Oh gosh, so much. Yeah. Well, in the intervening years, I actually did get to go to see the manuscript of The Great Gatsby in person. When I was researching this book, I spent time at Firestone Library, which has all of the manuscripts of Fitzgerald's novels, as well as many of his letters. But Firestone is very protective of Fitzgerald. I keep conflating the two names. And despite my best efforts, they would not let me see the manuscript. And so after my book came out, one of Fitzgerald's granddaughters, Bobby Lanahan, who has a lot to do with the Fitzgerald estate, intervened on my behalf. She liked my book, and she contacted Firestone Library, and the librarian who was then presiding over the rare book room allowed me and a few other Fitzgerald scholars and A. Scott Berg, who wrote the great biography of Maxwell Perkins that if you're into that era, you should read. He let all of us in for a day on Fitzgerald's birthday in September. And we were allowed to see the manuscript for like a half an hour. And I have to say, it was almost a religious experience to open that box and to look at that manuscript. But what was almost as amazing as the manuscript was Fitzgerald's first edition of The Great Gatsby. Gatsby comes out in 25, April 10th. There's a first edition and a second printing of that first edition in 1925, and that's it. So this is the first printing of the first edition. And in pencil, Fitzgerald has made changes. And those changes were incorporated into the second printing of the first edition. So imagine that. The novel is out, and he never stopped trying to make it perfect. And that almost is overwhelming to think about, that dedication to getting it done. There have been loads of conversations that I've had with students, with other Fitzgerald lovers, that have made me read lines differently and awakened me to different symbols and words in Gatsby. So if we had like another hour, I'd be happy to tell you about them, but I'm afraid you're all going to silently creep away. But it's been wonderful to have events like this, and even with the limitations of Zoom, to be able to talk to people who also love Fitzgerald and his writing, and to learn from them.
Excellent. Yeah, I really recommend everyone, because I know 90% of you have read Gatsby. I recommend you pick up a copy of So We Read On. I know it really enriched my experience of reading Fitzgerald. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. I hope I get to meet you someday in person.
Yes, I know. And now that things are slowly coming back, and that it does kind of feel like we are entering another roaring 20s.
It does. It does. It's yes. Everybody all over the country needs to reread Gatsby to get a sense of, kind of what we're in right now. Thank you for all those good words everybody is posting. I really appreciate it, and have a good rest of the summer. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.